Welcome as we continue to explore Bill Emerson's election to Congress and how it impacted Southeast Missouri politics. I'd like to welcome our guest, the 46th Lieutenant Governor of the state of Missouri, Peter Kinder. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Barry.
He also served in the state Senate for several years, and he was also, many people don't know this because it's been so long ago, but he served as Bill Emerson's first campaign manager. And over the next few episodes, we're here to discuss Bill Emerson's rise in politics. Governor, let's get into how you met Bill Emerson. He's near and dear to your heart, near and dear to many 8th Congressional District constituents' hearts still to this day. So how did y'all meet?
Yes, sir. I had graduated from law school in December of '79 and was spending the months of January and February 4 or 5 nights a week at a cram course to take the bar at the end of February in Missouri. And that course was St. Louis U, and one of my fellow classmates was Phyllis Schlafly, mother of 6 who had just finished her law school experience. So I was in St. Louis most of the time, and we're now getting toward late February. Well, every February there's something that Missouri Republicans have called Lincoln Day, State Lincoln Day, and it alternates between St. Louis, Kansas City, and Springfield. This year it happened to be in St. Louis, and it was at the downtown Marriott next to the ballpark. And I had studied 8 or 9 hours that day. It was a Saturday. It was snowing, and I thought, okay, Saturday night I'm not going to study anymore. I'm going to go down to Lincoln Day and see who I can run into, because I had been involved in college and had not been involved while in law school. So I went down there and somebody said, "You're from Southeast Missouri, the then 10th District. You need to meet this guy who's running for Congress down there." And I thought, really? Who's going to be our sacrificial lamb this time? Well, they said, "No, this guy's serious. He's been in D.C. most of his adult life, but he's a native of Jefferson County, and we want you to meet him." So they led me over and introduced me to Bill and Joanne Emerson and their press aide, who they had already hired, a guy named Joe Hunter. And that's how we met that evening at State Lincoln Day.
Governor, Southeast Missouri, you're a history buff of Southeast Missouri politics. Mm-hmm. You're a walking history book. You know about the J.V. Conrad Democratic machine back in the old days, even before my time, probably
I'd like
before
to
your
know
time.
more, but I do know about it.
So how did you take this job in 1980 in a Democratic stronghold? Like you said, you thought he was going to be the sacrificial lamb. And that was going to be a big challenge for you after you decided to kind of get hooked up with Bill Emerson.
Well, among the reasons, the answer to that question is that he had a good team already. He was structured well for the campaign. And by that I mean that he had hired the ace political consultant in the state at the time, a native of Sykeston. In fact, the town is named after his family, a guy named Al Sykes. Okay. Al Sykes had been involved, was one of the first young lawyers hired by a new attorney general in 1968-69 named Jack Danforth. And Al had cycled into the Danforth Senate campaign in 1970, where he fell short against Stuart Symington. Then he managed Kit Bond's '72 gubernatorial campaign, the first Republican governor since the 1940s. And then Al moved to Springfield. But Al had done other campaigns besides Kit Bond's, and Emerson had hired him. And Emerson showed me a 56 or 58 page campaign plan written by Al Sykes. And he said, "If you come aboard, it will be your job to implement this strategic plan, but you don't have to write it. You just have to get down in the trenches and sweat and execute it." So it was under Al's tutelage, very much my mentor in that first campaign, that we proceeded.
Just a side note, Governor, when did the 10th District become the 8th District?
It was the 10th District when we had 10 districts and had been that for decades. And after the 1980 census, we lost a seat and went to 9. And we were designated the 8th District in the redistricting that went to the federal courts. It was a 3-judge panel, the federal courts, that drew what became the new 8th District that has been that way ever since, except we've grown and grown and grown to the west.
So, Governor, you felt like you had a good team in place in 1980, I guess 79 to 80. He put that all-star team in place, and the sacrificial lamb, you got to thinking, wow, he's got a chance to win this.
Well, I immediately thought that. I thought the issue complex was setting up for a change election. I thought it might even set up for what we call a wave election, which it ended up being. I was a Reaganite before it was cool. I was for Reagan against Nixon when I was in the 8th grade. I was for Reagan against Gerald Ford when I was in college in '76. And now we had Reagan as the nominee, and I felt I was right to have stood by my man there, and that it might just be a time when we could pull off an unbelievable upset in a 3.5 to 1 or better Democratic district. There was only one state representative in 19 counties at the time, from Jefferson County to the Arkansas line, who was Republican. And that guy lost the next year in '82, the next election, and we replaced him with one other in Cape. So no state senators were Republicans. All but one state representative were Democrats. But I felt that I knew that they were conservative Democrats. In fact, my mother, maiden name was Hunter, and I knew they were all Democrats. And I knew that we probably wouldn't get a majority of them, but we would get enough that we could put together a win.
So your first opponent in 1980 was Bill Burleson. He was kind of a juggernaut there. He won many, many elections.
He was a legend.
Yes, I forgot how long he served, but for many, many years.
Bill Burleson had been Cape County, he was from Wardell here in the Boot Heel, but in Pemiscot County, but he had settled in Cape County, had been elected prosecuting attorney back then. The terms were 2 years, and he started in '62 and was reelected in a county that was trending Republican. He was unbeatable as prosecuting attorney, and then the seat came open, congressional seat, when Paul C. Jones from Kennett retired after 18 or 20 years in Congress. And that is the only time the seat has really been open since Paul C. Jones won it back in the 40s. Or 1950, whenever he went in. And Burleson wins an 11-man primary, and then he serves 12 years to 1980 to set the stage here. He had won here's another way to say it. He had won an election every 2 years since 1962, and it's now 1980. He was a legend in personal retail campaigning, knocking on door after door by the thousands, by the tens of thousands. He was an old Marine, and nobody could match him for that retail campaign style.
And he still was a retail campaigner until 2 years ago.
He was.
I remember his campaign promotional material always said he had more degrees than anybody and he held more elected offices than anybody.
Once a Marine, always a Marine.
Yes. So we were dominantly a Democratic Party here in 1980.
Oh, yes.
And you were going against this juggernaut, Bill Burleson. I think Bill may have had a few scandals going on in his office at that time. You had a very popular Republican candidate coming in, Ronald Reagan. So tell us how the stars lined up for you to pull this victory off. And the victory was 55.2 to 44.8. Bill Emerson defeats Bill Burleson.
Yeah, as I recall, it was 21,000 votes and change. Interestingly, we ran 10,000 votes ahead of Reagan in the district, who also won. A number of things, you referred to some scandals he had. They were sort of garden variety minor scandals, but taken together, they began to create an image of sloppiness, if you will, or carelessness on some things. So without going into those, they had reached a critical mass where the largest newspaper in the district, long before it was owned by Gary Rust, the Southeast Missourian was owned by a Canadian chain, Thompson Media, had editorially called for Bill Burleson to resign. He would not talk to the newspaper. He would not answer questions. He was, and that was not the only newspaper that took that view around the state. There was around the district, excuse me. There was a sort of rising up of discontent with him among the news media at a time when newspapers were still really, really important to get your message out. So they didn't care for him, and they were ready to entertain the idea of a fresh face. And I think the issue complex nationally got worse and worse. Here's one for this agricultural area. Jimmy Carter, you know, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in sometime in late '79. Jimmy Carter responded to that with two key policy moves. One was an Olympic boycott of the Olympics to be held in Moscow. Moscow saying, we're not going to send American athletes, and they didn't. And the other was a grain embargo. Now, on the sales to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries. Well, what did that do? Those countries went to Brazil and other places in Latin America to get their grain, and our farmers in the grain belt between the Appalachians and the Rockies lost those markets. So this was a time of double-digit inflation, of rising unemployment, and economists had never seen that. If you're going to have rising inflation, they always said you'd have a hot economy humming on all cylinders. But we had rising inflation and rising unemployment, necessitating the invention of a new word then called stagflation. And all of this created quite a toxic policy mix for incumbents and helped to set up a change election.
So as the campaign manager for Bill Emerson, you're talking about some of the issues of the day in 1980. Did you nationalize Bill Emerson's campaign,
yes,
or was it more local?
Yes, we did, and we did it starting early. So I go to work for him about, I don't know, 7th or 8th of March. It was still winter, and we've got Tax Day coming up, April 15th. A Republican idea at the time, and I would argue an historic Republican proposal, was brought to us by Jack Kemp, the then young congressman from Buffalo, New York, Republican, who was a former Buffalo Bills quarterback and just a truly transformational figure in American politics and an exciting guy. And he had proposed with Senator Roth from Delaware the Kemp-Roth tax cut, which was 30% across the board reduction of marginal tax rates, which then reached as high as 70% of your marginal income. He said, let's take those down 30%. So we went to the post office for a media event, a concocted media event on April 15th as taxpayers were putting their tax returns in the box at the post office. And we had the TV and the newspaper there and the radio, and we were saying, Bill Emerson is taking the pledge to vote for the Kemp-Roth tax bill. And that proved, I think, pivotal in the election.
It was a great time to start building that wedge between the Democratic Party and farmers in the 10th Congressional District, correct? With the grain embargo, it was an easy picking for you, right?
Well, I wouldn't say it was easy because there was so much. We were not far enough removed from the Civil War for the in 1980 for the ancestral loyalties that defined those voting patterns to break down. They had not broken down yet, so. There was still enormous resistance to the idea of a Republican. But again, the national issue complex combined with Burleson's own personal troubles were beginning to create the glimmers of hope that, you know, it might be doable.
So as the campaign drug along, you're probably getting a bigger skip in your step as momentum started building?
It happened to be the hottest summer of my life. I don't believe there's been a summer to equal it since. Not before in my life. Day after day, you can look it up, over 100 degrees in the summer. A drought. It was a good thing I was 25 years old because we worked parades. We worked. I remember we're sitting here. You and I are in Malden near the airport, and we came down. You know, in those days they still had an enormous fireworks on the 4th of July. We came down here and worked that, and we worked the parades in St. Francis County and the Lead Belt and everything we could get in that heat. The Sweet Corn Festival in East Prairie.
So you hit them all.
Where we ran into Burleson also on the 4th of July.
Yeah, he didn't miss many events.
No, he didn't.
You mentioned a really good story about Bill Burleson and kind of his retail politics, but it kind of backfired on him at one time.
Well, here's one where he did kind of stumble. We were at the Sweet Corn Festival every 4th of July in East Prairie. This was 1980, very hot, 4th of July, and it's in the morning, and we've gone through the parade, and they have speeches. Well, he was the incumbent congressman, so they're going to have him speak, and he gets up there, and there was a little media there, probably just one radio station. So Burleson gets up and makes his appeal as, "I'm the only boot heeler in this race," he said, with great volume and force. He said, "I'm the only one who understands agriculture. I'm the only one who understands your flood control needs down here and the drainage district issues." And he said, "My opponent's been a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. his whole life since higher education, and they had to go to the north end of this district to get a guy to run against me. I'm the only boot heeler in this race." So Al Sykes was our consultant I mentioned earlier, and he happened to be with us. It was rare that he was out on the hustings with us, but he was that day. And he said, "Peter, see if that radio guy, see if we can borrow that tape." So we were able to get our hands on the tape later. And in October, we saved that for a commercial that ran on radio in the north end of the district, St. Genevieve, St. Francis, and Jefferson County, all Democrat. And our message said, "Congressman Burleson is desperate. He is now condemning Bill Emerson for coming from the north end of this district." And we played his own words. So that hurt him up there. And we didn't carry St. Genevieve, but we did carry St. Francis and Jefferson. And that was the difference.
So, Governor, 55 to 44, did you ever dream that it would be that big of a margin on that first election?
I can't say we did. We would have taken 1 or 2 votes. I mean, it was thought to be that steep a hill to climb. And the day after the election, John Ramey wrote the story, and he wrote the truth in the Southeast Missourian, and I can still quote it. "It had long been thought," he said, "that no Republican could defeat a Democrat in the 10th district, especially Burleson."
Governor, a lot of things have changed in politics since 1980. Just simple things. Did y'all do polling back then? Did you know you were up or down?
We did, and we knew we were behind.
So you were behind up until...
We didn't do a great deal of polling. We couldn't afford it. That gets into our campaign budget and what we realistically thought we could raise.
Well, that is funny that you say the polling was off, because it's still off today. It's still not an exact science. So
it's inexact.
You did do some polling, but not a lot because you couldn't afford it.
Right.
And I think you told me at one time that's when the birth of the independent expenditure happened around 1980.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
So, and it directly impacted this race. So we set out to raise, in the winter of 1980, we hoped we could raise $200,000. On election day, we had raised $282,000, which so far exceeded our goal. And I thought that was one reason we were going to win. I was calling PACs, political action committees, on the phone in Washington, D.C. and in Missouri, trying to get checks. And one of the bigger places to go was the National Realtors PAC, which for us in Missouri was controlled by a guy named Sam Licklider, controlled by his board, but he was their agent. Sam Licklider, longtime lobbyist for the realtors in Jefferson City. So I didn't know Sam, but I was calling him on the phone, and I think he had given us some money in the primary. But then in the fall, in those days, the law said $5,000 in the primary and $5,000 in the general max. So I was calling him the day after the primary saying, "I need the $5,000. And he said, "Well, I want to come down and meet you." So he came down and met me. And I told him about our plan to have the former Democratic senator, state senator Al Spradling, former president pro tem of the Senate, and one of the titans of the Missouri Senate from his tenure in 1951 to 76, just 4 years before this race. I had persuaded, and we had persuaded Spradling to endorse Emerson. What I didn't know is how close Sam Licklider was to Spradling back in the days when they worked together. So Sam returned to Jefferson City and would not return any more of my calls about where's my $5,000 for the donation. This was enormously frustrating to me because I thought this was low-hanging fruit. Well, what he did was take this case national to the national realtors and say, who had decided they were going to experiment with 4 independent expenditures. That is, an expenditure that cannot legally be known by anybody in the primary campaign, okay, in the campaign itself. So I gave up calling him because I could see he wasn't going to send me any money. And then about 10 or 12 days out from the election in November, late October, here comes an avalanche of mail from the realtors to essentially every registered voter household in the 10th district saying, Emerson has pledged to vote for the Kemp-Roth tax bill. If he does, that will put this much back into the economy of the 10th district and will create this many jobs. And it was much better than if he had given me the $5,000. We were one of 4 in the nation that they selected to experiment on an independent expenditure. I know they lost one of them in Colorado. I don't know what happened to the other 2, but in Emerson race, it paid off with $117,000 of an independent expenditure. And then I called up Sam when that mail hit, and I said, now I see why you didn't return my calls.
Did you say, sorry, we got more than 5,000?
That was, I believe, the birth of independent expenditures.
One of your very first fundraisers you had with Bill Emerson was right here in Dunklin County down at Kennett.
That's right.
With a guy named Glenn, is it Glenn Brogdon?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that. That was an important experience for you too, right?
It was in the summer of 1980, and my goal was to try to raise $5,000 for a Republican in Dunklin County. Now, how in the world are you going to do that? Well, we got the enormously popular former Secretary of Agriculture, who had been an ag economics professor at Purdue, named Earl Butz. He was in the Gerald Ford cabinet. He was a hero in the Grain Belt for his advocacy and all throughout agricultural America for his advocacy for producers. So we got an airplane, and our plan was to bring him to Kennett and then Sikeston in the evening. So I drove down here from St. Louis, where we had an event the night before, and I had a meeting, and Glenn Brogdon and David Haggard, and probably David's dad, Doc Haggard, and Neil Lewis, and a handful of other folks from Kennett, we planned this fundraiser. I said, I need to make $5,000 on this fundraiser. I want 200 people at lunch. And I said, now, I got him talking, and I said, well, we can have so many men and then so many women. And Glenn Brogdon stopped me and said, I've got 2 things to say to you. First of all, you're down here in a part of Missouri where we're more used to getting paid by politicians than paying them. And secondly, the women, you're in the old Cotton South, he explained to me. You're in the old Cotton South, and the women will not come out to a business event in the middle of the day. That's for the men. And I thought, okay. Well, we forged ahead with our plan, and we hit our goal. I left here with Earl Butz to go to Sikeston for an evening event with him with $5,000 raised for the campaign.
So after that event, Earl Butz was kind of instrumental in kind of helping Bill Emerson have credibility in the ag community.
Beginning. He definitely did.
Governor, did you ever think that in 1980, the important work you were doing for the party would change from a blue tide to a red tide by 2021? I know it probably had to be a goal of yours, and it took a lot of time, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, but over the last 40 years, did you think you'd be in this spot politically?
Well, I never really thought about where I'd be in 40 years, but I would say that I saw the potential to flip these conservative Southern Democrats our way. I just didn't know how many would come our way or how long it would take. But I did feel that I would live to see the day when the old Civil War loyalties that defined the voting patterns would begin to break down. And so they did.
Do you feel like 1980 was that turning point where the ship turned the other way?
I do. However, it did not happen overnight at the state legislative level. We didn't have any state senators through the 80s from this district, Republicans. And we didn't really start getting any state representatives until 88 and 90. In 88, we won the Marvin Proffer seat in rural Cape County with David Schwab. And in 1990, Mark Richardson won over in Butler County. And that started what became a tsunami through the 90s and through the 2000s.
Emerson, Ashcroft, you just started seeing a lot of success, and you just kept building on that.
Yes.
So is there just one certain thing you can point to in that campaign that really elevated the campaign? And you're like, we're going to win this?
I would say it was Bill Emerson's performance, not only in that campaign, but also subsequently in office. where he developed and earned a reputation as a guy who would return phone calls, who didn't ask what your politics was, who didn't ask if you voted for him or not, or Democrat or Republican. He just wanted to deliver for the constituents and for the people, and work really hard. Let's face it, he was no agricultural expert when he started that campaign. He had been a lobbyist for the aerospace defense industry and been in D.C. for 20 years, but he proved to be a quick learner. We went to the Delta Center right there in Portageville, and we went to school on the cyst nematode and soybeans and cotton and all those things.
That reminds me of a couple stories. Lloyd Smith has told me, and R.D. James at New Madrid, they weren't really in his camp in 1980. And I think he told R.D. James, and maybe Lloyd that too, that I'm no agricultural expert. I know you probably didn't support me in 1980. I'm talking about R.D. James. He told me this story.
No, he didn't.
And R.D. said by 1982 or 84, here, I'm one of his campaign chairmen. He won me over because he would call me back.
82.
He would listen.
Yeah. So there's a fascinating story after Bill was elected, 1981, summer of 1981. And we became aware, something I didn't know, there's something called the Mississippi River Commission. The Mississippi River Commission, presidential appointments to the commission, to long terms. I think they're at least 6 or 7 years, they might be longer, amazingly long terms. The appointees have to be civil engineers, and the Mississippi River Commission is that commission under the Flood Control Act of 1927 that governs the lower Mississippi Valley, which is from Cairo, Illinois, to the mouth of the river. And this is a big deal to farmers and planters in the lower Mississippi Valley. Missouri had not had a member of the Mississippi River Commission since Harry Truman was president. And we became aware that they really wanted this appointment in the boot heel. I'm talking about major planters and farmers and cotton ginners who had all been against us in 1980. New Madrid County, Mississippi County, and down into the rest of the boot heel. They had a candidate named R.D. James. His father-in-law was sort of a legend, Dub Riley, A.C. Dub Riley, Amos Camden Dub Riley, Riley Cotton Company right there in New Madrid on the north end of town. Dub Riley had been appointed to 3 6-year terms, I believe, on the Missouri Highway Commission. He was our Southeast Missouri Highway Commissioner, a really big deal. Now the question was, are you going to appoint his son-in-law? Will President Reagan make this appointment? So we decided we wanted to do it, and we believed that in doing it, we could flip an enormous number of the folks, of the Democrats who had been with Burleson in the first 1980 campaign, because he sat on the Appropriations Committee and they wanted their appropriations, I totally understand this, for their flood control projects, principally closing the gap in the levee, which still has not been closed, near New Madrid. So anyway, we went down to the White House, Bill and I did, on a hot June day in 1981, to the old executive office building to meet with a young staffer in the political shop of the White House named Lee Atwater, who later became a legend nationally. And we explained to him what we were doing, and he said, he was from South Carolina. He said, I get it. I totally understand it. I'll see what we can do. Well, with Lee's pushing it through the White House, President Reagan made the appointment of R.D. James, and that made all the difference in converting what came to be known as Democrats. I believe the newspaper editor in Caruthersville, Mr. Clayton, coined that term. And they stayed with us. It was a wholesale move in our direction. There was also an article in the Globe Democrat, the then daily morning newspaper in St. Louis, in which Tom Eagleton was calling this and other moves Congressman Emerson was making as political masterstrokes. And I think the record will show that it was. R.D. was still on that commission, and when Donald Trump won 36 years later in 2016, having been appointed and reappointed by presidents of both parties, and he, I think, was the dominant force on that commission. And then President Trump, with Senator Blunt's help, reached down and made him Assistant Secretary of the United States Army for Civil Works, which means he has had, under Trump, he had all of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers coast to coast under him. It was, so that was an interesting little bit of history.
And I think that's the key point that RD felt like and Lloyd Smith felt like, that Bill Emerson didn't come in and bully everybody around. I know everything. He listened. He got to know the parts of the district he wasn't an expert on.
And he knew that this is a business of addition, not subtraction.
And he played that hand very well over the years. Lieutenant Governor Peter Kinder, it's been my pleasure to have you today. And thank you so much for sharing all these stories of Bill Emerson's political rise.
Thank you. Pleasure's mine.
It's a long time coming. I'm glad we finally got together.
Thank you.
And please join us our next episode. We'll have Lloyd Smith. He took over for Peter Kinder whenever Peter Kinder moved on to bigger and better things in 1980, after the 1982 campaign. Lloyd Smith kind of took over where Peter left off, and we'll be having Lloyd Smith here in the studio.